Lieder sind Brüder der Revolution, Lieder sind ihre Begleiter.
I'm Hannah Judd.
I'm Sydney Hutchinson.
This is Playing the Archive, a podcast of Second World music.
Welcome to Playing the Archive. I'm Sydney Hutchinson.
And I'm Natalia Neira Nieto.
We're here today with Alejandro Madrid, professor of music at Harvard University. Hi, Alejandro.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for being here. If you were going to check a box on a form, would you check ethnomusicologist, historical musicologist, none of the above, or something else?
I would probably check something else.
Do you have a definition for the something else? Or is this a non-binary?
I usually call it sound and music scholar.
Perfect. Okay, well, out of many topics that we could talk to you about today, we particularly want to get into your book, of course, that's just about to come out with Duke University Press, The Archive and the Aural City. So let's get started.
So, how did you get interested in this topic?
So the idea of the project started when I went to Mexico back in 2012 or 2013 to teach what was the first seminary in sound studies at the National University of Mexico. One of the activities that we did is we visited the Fonoteca Nacional in Mexico City, the National Sound Archive in Mexico. I contacted the administration of the archive and I told them that I wanted to bring my students, so they organized this tour of the facility and they gave us the official speech of what the mission of the archive was about. For the purposes of the seminary, it worked out just finely, but I was very interested in the reaction from my students. All of them were somehow skeptical about the mission of the archive and about this idea that they would actually gather and collect and store the sounds of the nation. Just the very idea of what is the sound of the nation, no? Was something that created tension among the students. And I kept thinking about it again and again. I kept thinking about a particular moment in which one of the members of the team told us about the origin of the archive itself. So when they started gathering sounds and recordings, they had an open call. So people started donating things. And many of the things that they were donating were things that the archive was not interested in, like videotapes of family weddings or sounds of when they recorded their baby's first speech. They told us we didn't know what to do with that, so we just put them aside and they're not part of the archive. And I kept thinking, well, that's maybe the most interesting thing, what you guys have. So I was thinking about what is it that didn't make it into the archive because it didn't translate into this national mission of the archive. No? So that was the origin of why I started thinking about archives. And then it's expanded into this larger project.
Here at the Ethnological Museum, I think priorities are changing because a couple of months ago, there was a day where they invited people to bring in their home movies to screen here and potentially to be copied into the archive. It's just a funny coincidence.
I wish they did that. Well, I think the National Archive, they have a new team. The director changed a couple of years ago. The new team is people who are very intellectually invested in some of these questions. So they are thinking about ways of including these types of materials in the archive.
Part of what you cover in this book, it's the archive here in Berlin. Could you tell us more about your experience with it?
With the archive here, the Berliner Phonogram Archive, I was interested in a very particular collection of that archive, which is the collection of Mexican recordings by Preuss, which he made in 1905 and 1907. He was in Mexico City, sent by the Ethnographic Museum to gather materials, not only sounds. And in fact, I think that he actually decided to gather sounds once he was in New York and he talked to Lumpels and some of the other folks who had already done research in Mexico. And that's when he decided, okay, I should also be prepared to make recordings. So that was not the original plan. Let's say that there were two aspects of that particular expedition. One was the official museum mission, which was to gather materials for the archive here. And then there was the academic and more scholarly mission that he had for himself. So he had his own agenda that was different from the agenda of the museum. And his agenda was about trying to understand the religious and spiritual world of the Aztecs For him, recording the religious chants of these communities in the Sierra Madre, which are Nahuatl communities, was a way into understanding the mentality of the pre-Hispanic world, because he thought that these communities had no eye contact with European or modern society. Of course, this is all very questionable and problematic, but that was the reason the whole expedition started. And at some point, he understood that in order to actually be able to transcribe the lyrics of these chants, he needed to make recordings. So I was really interested in those recordings, especially because at the time, in the 2010s or so, Mexican anthropologists became very, very interested in that because they wanted to publish a translation of Preuss's book into Spanish. A lot of the book in Preuss is the transcriptions of the chants. So they were wondering, how do we go about transcribing these chants and translating them into Spanish? Should we translate from the German translation of the original Huichol or Cora languages, or should we actually try to translate them from the original? So they, in a way, had to retrace his text and record the chants again. The whole project became very, very convoluted. But to me, that was the interesting aspect of what I wanted to do with this particular collection, to see how is it that the circulation more than 100 years later of these sounds and these recordings got them back to Mexico and to these communities, and what these communities wanted to do with them or not wanted to do with them.
Going back to the title of your book, you reference the Aural City in it, but you did research in two main actual cities, physical cities, Berlin and Mexico City. Could you tell us more about the Aural City and if it relates in some way to these actual cities of your research?
Thanks for that question, because it gives me the opportunity to clarify some issues with that term. When I speak about the Aural City, I don't speak about an actual urban space, but I speak about an intellectual elite that moves in cities and that relates to the idea of city in terms of the idea of civilization. So it is a civilizing project that comes to us, at least in the Latin American tradition, from the notion of the later city, La Ciudad Letrada, which was Angel Rama's definition of the elite that tried to create a particular intellectual and civilizing project in Latin America with the arrival of the Spaniards. This is how he defines it. It's a very small elite of intellectuals who know how to write and that control the circulation of the written word. And what I wanted to do was to see if that translated into the contemporary moment that we're living with the sonic turn, and whether there was an elite, intellectual elite, that was interested in understanding new ways of conceptualizing reality and a new civilizing project that was somehow distancing itself from the project of the written word, from logocentrism. No? So that's what the Aural City is about. And I was really interested in this concept because I had seen young folks in Mexico City at different moments of my previous research projects that related to the idea of sound in a very different way that, for example, someone who was trained in a musicological program would do it. They were interested in contemporary music and contemporary experimental music, but the way of entering had nothing to do with how someone who's trained in music would actually do it. So I could see those folks when I was doing my research about Julian Carrillo. They would come to these concerts, and even the musicians themselves would say, yeah, these crowds are a little bit different. They're not the crowd that would usually come to an experimental music concert. So I would find them there, and I would find them when I went to teach the sound seminar in Mexico City, and also another seminar that I taught about performance studies. Some of them came to basically audit the class, no? And they were not part of the School of Music, as it was called back then. So I was interested in this elite of intellectuals who were thinking about sound in a different way. And that's sort of how I started defining it, as an intellectual civilizing project that moves away from logocentrism.
So it's a kind of cosmopolitanism, isn't it, though?
Yeah. And what I find, especially in the last chapter of the book, I speak a little bit about this, because what I do in that chapter is I sort of start mapping out networks of people who I believe are part of this. I mean, it's not a formal group, right? They just do things that are similar, and they approach it in a similar way. And many of them are networks that go beyond the nation state. They are cosmopolitan networks of people all over Latin America. And in this case, I was focused in Latin America, but there are also connections beyond Latin America. I believe that this is a group of people who are trying to do something different. And many of the things that they do react against the notion of the nation state as a unit of identification and understanding, or interpretation.
So now we come to archive, the other word and the title of your book. So you talk there about these two different concepts, one from Terry Cook and the other one from Akil Membe. You make this differentiation between archive, without a plural, and archives. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was always fascinated with the idea of the archive is that when you present your work, you always have this question, like, what is your archive? What was your archive? What are you basing your assumptions or your conclusions on? And it usually is not a particular space. I mean, sometimes it might be an archive, a particular collection that you just studied and then you analyze and you examine. But in many other cases, it's not. It's something that you put together. So there were these two ideas of the archive as an institution and an archive as something that is more malleable, something that is the result of the case, or in this case, the listening of the archive or the researcher. The way I say it, there's the physical space that's usually part of a larger institution that follows a particular policy or a mission. And there's other archives that I wouldn't say that they're necessarily non-ideological. All archives, there's an ideology behind, right? But that are organized in different ways, that at least are ideologies that in a way against the grain.
Of course, you also visited a number of actual archives in doing your research, including this one here, the Berlin Phonogram Archive, as well as the Fonoteca Nacional. We were wondering how these archives tell us different stories today in comparison from what the creators of the archives perhaps intended.
Yeah, well, let's start with your archive, because we're here, but also because it's the one that has the longer history, so we can actually see how the mission changes. You were just mentioning this idea that everyday sounds are actually coming into the archive more and more, and that you guys are more interested in that. And that's, I think, it's hugely different from what people were thinking it was worth preserving back at the beginning of the 20th century, right? Most of these archives were created under the auspices of either large imperial projects or national projects. As such, they respond to this idea of an imaginary of what the nation should be or what the political entity should be. In many cases, they reflect ideas about colonialism because of the particular moment in they were created. And they also reflect the tensions of the people who are being researched and what the researchers believe about them. So once you step back and you look at the archive with some distance, you can actually identify very easily that at that time it was that particular project. The nation building project, it was the empire building project that defined what sounds were recording and that were kept. Now, as we can see, things are very different. No? Now this particular archive is part of the Humboldt Forum. It's housed by the Forum, and the Forum was created with a different mission, which is actually a mission that interrogates that particular history and that puts on the table the question of colonialism. It's still problematic because, the materials are still there, the collections are still there, and some of the people who criticize the projects are still saying, well, you are reproducing these ideas by putting those things in exhibition, right? I think that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is you are actually putting that question on the table, and everyone who goes to that exhibit will be forced to start thinking about that. No? How is it that these things got here? Why are they here? And what were the politics behind the fact that we have them here and they're not with the people who produce them? So in that sense, I believe that it's almost completely opposite of what the project was at the beginning. No? And the Fonoteca Nacional project is a little bit different because it's a more recent project. Still, you can see that it was another project that was based on the idea of the nation state, and the mission of the Fonoteca was defined as the archive of the sounds of the nation, to preserve the sounds of the nation. Of course, the problem is who defines what the sounds of the nation are and what enters and doesn't into that archive. And I believe that at the beginning of that project, they had a very sort of narrow idea of what the sounds of the nation could be. And they're slowly opening up what those sounds may be, to include everyday sounds, and especially to include sounds that may reflect the crisis of the nation state. For example, the sounds of violence, the sounds of the narco violence in Mexico, and how they are featured in those archives. No?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the Ethnological Museum, though, a lot of the objects are going away and are not in the museum on display or even belonging to the museum anymore, because this is one of the museums that's been giving back large numbers of objects. And then the ones you see on display are often those that the home country has then decided can remain here and be on display. I don't know that this affects the sound archives as much as it does the ones with these rather spectacular physical objects like the Benin bronzes. But are they housing sounds of indigenous groups that then indigenous groups may want returned or not heard, perhaps?
Yeah, they do have. Now, the issue with the Fonoteca Nacional is that most of those indigenous sound are collections of researchers who donated them to the Fonoteca Nacional. So it's not that the Fonoteca actually sent anyone to record them, right? There's a few projects in which that happened. Their Soundscapes project included a little bit of that. But the larger part of the collection that includes those sounds are probably the Yurchenko collection, the Thomas Stanford collection. Obviously, because these two scholars dedicated their lives to recording those sounds. So again, Yurchenko was active in the 50s, throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and Thomas Stanford the same, no? So they started doing these projects when maybe the questions of ethics that we have today about how we relate to those communities were very different, and the protocols that we use today were not followed at all. They wouldn't even think about them back then. So that raises a question of, okay, so these collections were recorded 50, 60 years ago, now by this archive, what they can do. I'm not sure that this is something that the Fonoteca is actually addressed in terms of policy, but I'm sure that the people who are there now have these questions in their mind. So something may happen, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And well, talking about sound archives, it's not just sounds what you find in there. What other materials have you encountered? Are there any that have surprised you?
The only two formal archives that I actually visited for this collection were the Fonoteca and this one, the Phonogram Archive in Berlin. All the other archives were archives that I somehow put together. And there's one that's an archive that was sounds collected by a French artist in Mexico City. And he made that into an open access for anyone who wanted to use those sounds to use that. So what is there in the internet, in a way, is an archive, no? But it's not an archive in the sense of that it's not an institution. There's no building that houses anything. That's probably one of the things that I found very interesting when I was doing the research. These archives that do things like that are somehow not institutional archives, and that do not engage the notion of the document in the same way that an institutional archive would. And what I mean by that is they do not think of the document and the archive as a site of authority, or as a site of originality, or a site that should restore things that are unique. So I found that in this archive of recordings made by Felix Blumit, which is the one that I was just talking about. It's a CD called Disco Pirata. And I also found that out in another archive that I write about in relation to Disco Pirata in that chapter, in one chapter of the book, which is an archive called Mexican Rarities. But it's an archive of material that you can find anywhere else. So there are copies of other documents, right? But the reason why they store them is because of how these documents have been neglected in other archives. So in a way, they are reimagining the significance of these documents in a way that somehow transcends the missions of the archive that originally kept them. So I found that really interesting. The fact that, you store something that's not original, something that in the traditional understanding of an archive would probably have no value because, okay, there's many of them, or there are copies. Think a bit about it in Benjaminian terms.
Yeah. Another idea you bring up in your book is lo inaudito, the unheard or the unknown, as a way of placing emphasis on the surprising or the unexpected. I think about the cylinders of the Berlin Phonogram Archive and how they might be inaudito. They can be very hard to listen to, these old recordings, but the expectation of those who made them was that they would be listened to at least at some point in order to transcribe them. So what are some other ways you found of approaching a sound archive that we can't hear or that are difficult to hear, ways of consulting the material other than those intended?
Well, I think actually some of the materials in the Preuss collection are a very good example of that. What you have in those recordings is usually you have Preuss at the very beginning of the recording stating this is such and such a chant and it's being sung by such and such a person in this particular town in Mexico. And then you have the chant, or what is supposed to be the chant. Now, that is not supposed to be the important part of the archive. According to the original mission of the archive, what is important is what follows, right? But to me, that was super interesting. Just listening to Preuss, I'm not fetishizing the voice of Preuss, but just the fact that, you have Preuss right there telling you what is it that you are going to listen to. In a way, it's a performative kind of speech. It's telling you, and by telling you, it makes that fragment of a chant into the chant. And then the authority of the archive actually makes it into the chant. And then when it goes back to the community, it's challenged because the community was like, well, these are not our chants. Like maybe these are kind of similar to our chants, but they are not really ours. So that's one of the central aspects of that particular chapter, no? What happened when they went back to the community. But listening to Preuss, to me, it was a moment in which I understood that the mediation of the technology and the mediation of the researcher was central in understanding what is it that these recordings are. No?
Yeah. This is something that's always struck me about our research is that I think when people think of ethnomusicologists or musicologists, they think of us sitting around listening to music, whereas very often we're listening to the things around the music, even more than to the music itself. And this also struck me. I had a similar experience to you listening to the Preuss recordings. One time I was asked to go to the Lomax archive to identify some Dominican recordings that they had not well documented at the time. So Lomax, his Spanish was not very good, and he also didn't understand how locals referred to their music in the Dominican Republic. So he just recorded a man playing a merengue on accordion, and he asked who was the composer of this song. So he asked for the compositor of the canción. The guy was completely confused because, first of all, it was not a canción. It was a merengue. And then when they sorted that out, he still didn't understand what he was going for because the notion of composition was totally different. And he said, he was me, Epifanio Capellan, compositor de merengue, because I'm the one who played it. I created it just now, even though it was a standard piece of repertoire that had been around for decades. So that was the most interesting part to me of listening to those recordings. Did you have any other moment like that that just stuck out in your mind as this moment of recognition of what was going on at the time that they were recording those documents?
Probably it was when I heard sound installation by Maria Sanchez. It's a sound installation that is based on recordings that she took from the internet, actually from YouTube, recordings that people would actually make with their cell phones. There was a shootout in Mexico with narco against the military or whatever. She took those sounds and recorded them and then reproduced the sounds in loudspeakers that were shaped like guns. And I kept thinking, evidently these are the sounds that a national archive doesn't want because they speak about the crisis of the nation state. So listening to that was also a moment in which I identified one of the tensions with the Fonoteca archive. And I was like, well, why wouldn't the Fonoteca actually store these sounds, and why would she actually need to go to the internet to find the sounds that are not there? No? So that sort of, not only tension, but that difference between the institutional archive and the archive that is located somewhere else, that have the things that are actually important to people, either to identify themselves or to recognize their surroundings and do something about their safety by listening to their surroundings. But those are not in the National Archive, they are somewhere else.
So, talking about the internet, what do you think are some of the challenges that sound archives may encounter today?
So a lot of the archives that I write about, especially in the last chapter of the book, are archives that are located in the internet. So the virtual archives, I call them sort of invisible, because one of the challenges of this type of archives is that they're there, but you can only see them if you know or you enter the right network. So if you enter the right network, if you meet the right person, then that might lead you into one of these archives. But if not, it's an archive that you will not hear and you will not see. So I think that's one of the challenges of the virtual archives, how to make them visible. And in some cases, people may not actually want those archives to be visible. That's another issue. But I'm also thinking about the fact that when we think about this archive, we think about them as somehow permanent, but they're not. And not only in terms of the digital archive, but also the fact that, servers disappear, links are broken. So these are also somehow fragile archives in a different way.
Alejandro, I've lost count of how many books you've published, but you've been very prolific, and your books have covered a lot of different sorts of topics, from Nortec, Northern Mexican electronic music and art collective, through experimental musics of Latin America and the circulation of danzón, dance and music between Cuba and Mexico. How does this project relate to those other ones, or has it grown out of them in some way?
When you just take a step back and look at what I've written, it looks like, well, the topics are kind of random. But I think there's an intellectual project behind all of them, which is the question of the nation state. I mean, I've written about borders, and we have collaborated in projects about borders. And to me, the central question when you are talking about the limits of the nation state is what is this nation state that we're talking about? So all of them have that in common, which is trying to find a unit of interpretation that transcends the nation state, that speaks about the experiences of the people who are either making the music or producing these archives, that is very different from the sort of restrictive understanding of identity that the nation state provides. So I would say that that's sort of the central project behind all of them, but also trying to find out different ways of understanding how we relate to the other. So it's a question of identity. And I believe that we live in this very polarized moment because we tend to demonize the other, and it highlights so much difference. So I'm trying to find out a way to somehow overcome that and find a new way to speak about how is it that we share things, no? What do we have in common? And I believe that all of the books have that. In some of them is more like a seed, and some of them is more developed, but that's behind all of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe that makes way for us to talk about the next project, because I know that just because you have one book coming out right now doesn't mean you don't have the other one underway. So I wonder if you want to mention what your next book project is dealing with.
I'm working on a book about the first album that Silvio Rodríguez, the Cuban singer-songwriter, released, and that was in 1975. So it's 50 years since that album came out. And what I'm trying to do is a micro-history of the album. So I take the album as a point of entry into a particular moment in history. That's the early 70s in Cuba, which speak about the transformation of this utopian dream of the Cuban Revolution into the Sovietization, the moment when the economy Sovietizes and it basically becomes a satellite of the Soviet Union. So some of those things you can trace in the songs and in the history behind the songs. But also coming back to the moment that we're living in and how many of these ideas that for many decades were considered outdated. I'm not talking necessarily about the economic ideas of communism, but I'm talking about the ethics behind these ideas, how they might be very relevant today, in the world we live in. Questions about collective belonging and about the flourishing of us as part of larger communities, not only as individuals, which were central, I think, for these people, and that you can hear in every single song of that album, no? That I am only when I am with the people that I'm a part of, the group that I'm part of. And I think the moment that we live is something that we should really go back to and think, because it's very relevant. So that's what I'm interested with that particular album. And also it happens to be very close personally. I grew up listening to that album, and for many years I was thinking I should write something about this album. And what was it, maybe like 3 years ago, I mentioned it to my wife and I said, I want to write about this album, but these guys are dying or leaving Cuba. And then she told me, so when did that album come out? And I said, I don't know, 73, 74. And she said, maybe it came out in 75. So I checked out and it was 75, so it was going to be 50 years. So I was like, okay, I need to write this album. Now, I wanted to finish it last year, but it didn't happen. So it won't come out this year, but it's close to the 50th year celebration.
Close enough. Yeah, 1975 was such a great year in so many ways. And I'm a little bit obsessed with the 70s myself. I've noticed that I keep coming back to it again and again in my research. It was kind of key in my research on Dominican music in the 1970s. And then also here for looking at East German Latin American relations. So I think that we're going to have a lot of crossover between our projects at this point. Also because Silvio Rodríguez was, of course, coming to play in East Berlin at different times, taking part in the festivals here. In 1973, the World Festival of Youth and Students was in East Berlin, and many Cubans came here. And then the following one in 78 was in Havana, and then many Germans were going there. Everybody was listening to each other's music, kind of cross-fertilizing. I wonder if you want to comment more on these connections between Berlin and Cuba that you've found.
Yeah, well, that's the one that I found that I was very interested in because of that particular project, that Silvio Rodríguez's first trip outside of Cuba was to be part of that festival, to play there. I haven't actually found a lot from the Cuban side. I haven't really found a lot of information about it other than Silvio saying things about it. And I interviewed Silvio and he told me a little bit about it. But it would be fascinating to find out what the conversation would look like or sounded like from the other side. At the time, Silvio and Pablo, they were not that well known. It was not until after, actually, one of the songs that comes out in that album called El Mayor by Silvio Rodríguez, that the song that actually converted into a banner of the Cuban Revolution because the political elite of the country, of the Communist Party, liked that song. They became, from being marginal musicians to be the banners of the revolution. It would be interesting to find out how is it that they were seen when they came here.
You'll have to read mine for that.
It wouldn't be the first time that our projects overlap.
That's true. That's true. It won't be the last either.
Well, I think we've come to an end. Maybe there's just one last question. So you mentioned about going back to the archive, about this relationship between performance and archive. It's not just about the person who interacts with the archive who is performing, but the materials in itself. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. I think one of the central aspects of this relationship that we have with archives is not only how we think about the archive, but also, this is going to sound very strange, but what is the agency of the documents in the archive? And in many ways, we don't realize how they affect us, or how the documents, in a way, produce us as researchers. And that's something that's also central in the discussion about the archive and the project, especially when you have a document that has been so charged with particular ideologies and when they clash with us as individuals. So what happens then? No? So I do believe that objects in archives have agency, and finding out the affect of that agency, I think is important.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us and talking with us about your research.
Thank you for the invitation again.
And thank you everybody for listening to us today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we did.
Playing the Archive is part of the Second World Music Project, led by Dr. Sidney Hutchinson and housed at the Institute for Musicology and Media Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. The project is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and the podcast is produced with the support of the Media Department of Berlin's Ethnological Museum and Museum for Asian Art. In this episode, you heard a Oaxacan soundscape and a bit of balbuceos by Julian Carrillo, provided by Alejandro Madrid. You also heard Konrad Preuss speaking on a cylinder recording in the collection of the Berlin Phonogram Archive. That's all for now, but not forever. Thanks for joining us.